Please sit down. Mr. Candidate, you confront a committee which was appointed by the Council of Deans that's charged with the task of examining both your dissertation and the propositions submitted therewith. Professor Zuiderveen Borgesius is invited to start the examination, and I would like to welcome you here in Leiden, because you are not from Leiden. The other opponents will not get a special welcome. They are welcome, of course, but now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations with a very impressive book. I was impressed by the enormous amounts of literature that you have consulted from various disciplines, and also impressed with your clear writing style. And I was also impressed about a decade ago. I wrote. Am I still, does it still work? Okay. About a decade ago, I wrote a book myself on behavioral advertising. And I defined it, but you improved the definition, so I like that a lot. So, congratulations. I have also a question, several questions, but I'm allowed only one to start with. You are brave enough to provide a definition of manipulation. And that is brave because many scholars have not dared to try. A couple of scholars have tried, and you too, very brave. I never had the guts to try to define that difficult phrase. You say that one of the elements of manipulation is that it is hidden, but almost a couple of times a month, actually, I come home and my son and my wife start laughing at me because, for instance, I bought 6 tubes of toothpaste or 3 packages of rice, and then both my son and my wife know, oh, Frederick, was there a pay 2, get 3 deal again? And I always fall for it. So I know I'm being manipulated by marketers, but I basically, I guess I'm a cheap person, like many Dutch people, so I can't help myself. So I feel manipulated by marketers, but according to your definition, I am not manipulated because it's pretty open what is happening there. They just say, pay less and you get free products, and Frederick falls for it all the time. So, yeah, I wonder whether you could explain to me why the hidden aspect of manipulation for you is so important, because for me, many marketing practices are quite obvious, manipulative, but still people fall for it. And yeah, I feel manipulated, for instance, because then we end up with crazy amounts of rice or toothpaste. Thank you.
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you very much for your question, and thank you very much for a great compliment, which means a lot to me. Indeed, I modified the definition that was found in your book. Luckily, I had a chance that there was many years or some years in between your book and mine to see also the different perspectives and adapted definitions to make up my own mind with that. But I do think that it remains close to that. Now to the question of manipulation. I do understand that my decision to define manipulation and provide a framework is brave, and I had a big problem when deciding whether or not to do that. But I saw that there is a need, there was a certain need in academia to somehow find a workable solution. I realized through working that whatever I would come up with wouldn't be perfect, but I chose to provide first step towards some more workable framework. Now, in terms of addressing why I chose that specific framework, which highlights manipulation as hidden form of influence. Firstly, I find this, just to highlight also for the audience, this framework is not from me, but from Sasser, Beate Rössler, and Helen Nissenbaum, which define manipulation as hidden influence. And there are two reasons. First, I will explain coherence of the framework itself, and then my personal choice, why I chose that. So, firstly, I think your example is great because it allows us to play with bits different forms of influence, right? So what they suggest is that once the influence becomes overt, so you realize that somebody is trying to manipulate you, you're presented with a choice. Either you accept or either you don't. If you are presented with a choice, but you think that it's irresistible for you, then that means that you were not manipulated, but forced, coerced. Like same as alcohol addiction or gambling addiction, when you know that this is an addiction, but you're not able to resist it, therefore this is something that forces you to behave in a certain way. But if you choose that, okay, this is two alternatives that I can handle, but I still go with this choice, then you have been persuaded. You haven't been manipulated because you were aware and you were conscious about it. So it's just this framework offers us this sort of definition or split. Although I also understand that this is not a perfect framework, but from all the different frameworks that I found, that I read, this is the most complete and most internally coherent framework that I found. Second, and I come why I chose this framework also for using for my thesis. And the primary reason is the wording of the European Union legal framework, especially the consumer protection law, and also the other regulative acts like GDPR and etc., which provides the clear distinction between misleading and aggressive practices, in which misleading is clearly about hiddenness, transparency, narrative. So in the end, I want this to be a tool for enforcers and for the industry to navigate this terrain, and if they were to do that, they can use a framework that is similar, at least so allows like it's easily connected with that regard. And and I'm sure that we will, after this book and after the discussion is continued, we will find a better framework. I will be the first one to drop this one. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, I wasn't heavily criticizing the framework, and it is nice to know that, at least according to your opinion, I would still have a choice of try to resist the marketer's tricks next time in the supermarket. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, then the examination will be continued by Professor Mak.
Thank you. Dear candidate, let me start by congratulating you on a wonderful thesis. It's very well structured. I learned a lot from reading it, and I also agree with most of what you write. So in terms of questions, that makes it a bit tricky what to ask about. Still, there are further questions that can be raised. And my question relates, probably not surprisingly, to the protection that consumer law can give against manipulation. I just heard a very nice example of manipulation. So Frederick buys 3 packets of rice in the supermarket. Now, one could say under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that he made an economic decision that he would not have made without the manipulative information. So that's what the UCPD protects against. Now, in your thesis, you discuss the interface with other areas of European law, for example, the GDPR. And my question relates to that. So the most exciting case law that we see at this time, and your thesis is one of the works of scholarship that alerted me to this, are cases where contract law interacts with other areas, for example, data protection law or freedom of expression. And you discussed the case law, German case law and Italian case law concerning the terms and conditions of Facebook, or as it is called now, Meta, where restrictions are placed on the freedom of expressions of users of the platform. And the courts in both countries determined that consumer law, the UCPD, but also the Unfair Contract Terms Directive, can be used by the court to determine whether these restrictions are fair. Now, I find that intriguing because we're not only looking at economic fairness here, but also the restrictions to the fundamental right of freedom of expression. And my take on this is that the courts are looking for creative ways to protect consumers. But my question to you is this really still within the realm of consumer law? Or are we expanding the borders of consumer law beyond the economic interests that it normally deals with? So my question to you is, what are your thoughts on this? Can consumer law that is normally focused on economic interests also protect these types of interests of consumers? And perhaps as an additional question, realizing that this may be opening Pandora's box, I'm wondering whether courts could have recourse to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in this regard.
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you very much for your question. I would like you to repeat the second question. I didn't well.
Yes. The second question is a very broad question, whether besides the consumer law instruments that I've mentioned, the courts could have recourse to the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Thank you very much for your question, and I also greatly appreciate the compliment about the thesis. I think your question is very difficult to answer, both first and the second. As you have rightly mentioned, the consumer protection law, I think very fundamental part of the consumer protection law is that it focuses on the economic behavior of the consumer and therefore limits the economic harms that go with that. And the court cases that you mentioned, as well as later in a different field, but also a competition law case, Meta Bundeskartellamt, what we see is a trend, or way I observe it, a trend where authorities try to creatively, as you also highlight, try to find different synergies or different ways to safeguard consumers from other forms of harm. And to tell you my opinion on this, because I think it is a very creative and very emerging trend, I think that it's, personally, I believe that it is the only way to go. And why, I will explain it, I will clarify this in following remarks. I think one of the most difficult things that I did in my thesis, which was, I think, it is very easy to criticize in the legal realm, is to construct theories of harm that synergizes both market and the fundamental rights harms together. This was always avoided by lawyers because one field of law was, focusing on the consumer welfare, another field of law was focusing on the dignity harms or the fundamental rights narrative. And it was always easier to say, okay, these are two different dimensions and we don't touch each other. But in reality, the consumer practices, business to consumer transactions, have effect in both realms. And this is becoming an unavoidable fact. The specific influence that a business has on a consumer affects the consumer's freedom of expression, consumer's privacy, and what I argue is also the dignity of a consumer. And that's what I try to construct, this concept of consumer dignity, in which I try to reconcile the the dignity or fundamental rights issues with the consumer. Of course, this is not a traditional way of thinking in law. This is something that is trying to improve or suggest a better fitted tool that can better deal with the phenomena that is occurring. So I think, going back to your second question this time, I do agree that in the future we might actually see those references to the Charter of the Fundamental Rights in consumer law cases, which will be a very provocative thing to do by the courts, but it will also be the continuation of the trend that I personally see and that is also reflected in my thesis. So I think we are in the very interesting times where we see the synergies, and in the end, it's reconstructing of we talked about this, the imaginaries of the community, of the society, and imagining the economic interests together with other important interests such as freedom of expression or privacy. Yeah, this would be my answer. It's a very difficult question, but I think as you can also see it in the going forward part, I focus exactly on this on these topics, and I suggest that the future research is mostly needed to reconcile these ideas together. Thank you.
Could I ask one
Yes,
brief
please,
follow-up?
continue.
Why do you think the courts are not currently using the Charter, but instead are using the UCPD or the Unfair Contract Terms Directive?
I believe that that would be to remain very close to the letter of the law. Like competition law or competition policy, it would be unimaginable, I think, for many competition lawyers to be told that they're supposed to be thinking about Charter of the Fundamental Rights in their policy analysis or their economic predictions and etc. That has been traditionally the way, and I think to break those silos requires some sort of consensus in academia, in lawyers, and this consensus has to be created by work such as this, and of course the criticism, and then communication between the scholars. To then the enforcer and then the adjudicator is more confident and brave to make these decisions. We have seen the European board of the EDPB making very brave and bold movements, and it's criticized by lawyers from the certain domains that are only focused on those domains, and they think, oh my God, this is outrageous because we're breaking the silos, and why are we discussing a fundamental right when this is an economic issue, and etc. So I think this holistic overview of the bird's eye view on what's happening. I'm lucky because I'm an academic and I have that, and I think people who work, let's say, 30 years in a private law firm with the consumer protection focus, who are very economical, and they look at that, they would be resistant to accept this. And of course, court has to also take that into consideration, how this evolves into a new phenomena and new understanding of the law. That would be my opinion to that. I think it's very difficult to answer otherwise.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mak. Then the examination is continued by Professor Schermer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Esteemed candidates, I've also read your thesis with great pleasure and interest. It was a joy to read, but of course I have questions. My question concerns the different manipulative practices concerned with online behavioral advertising, or OBA. On page 41, you state that OBA has 3 cumulative components. 1, advertisement is targeted towards individual consumers. 2, targeting is based on observed consumer behavior. And 3, consumers' behavior is observed and/or the consumer is targeted online. So the defining feature of OBA is thus the monitoring of behavior and the subsequent use or abuse of these observed behaviors for advertising purposes. On page 103, you give an overview of all the manipulative practices associated with OBA, and my compliments for all those clear tables in the thesis. While most of those practices are specific to OBA, or are in any case made more effective by observing and/or exploiting observed behavior, many manipulative practices that you list, such as autoplay, endless feed, or nagging, do not necessarily involve observed behavior. Furthermore, on page 218 you state, and I quote, "Consumer manipulation via OBA refers to situations when, for example, digital service providers design online interfaces with the default features that maximize data extraction from the consumer, such as autoplay, content personalization, endless feed, and gamification, at times without alternative and transparency around the economic logic. It seems to me that the manipulative practices such as autoplay and endless scroll can be used for commercial purposes, even without OBA existing. My question to you is therefore, do you feel that your recommendations, which focus on stricter enforcement of existing rules and more guidance on OBA, will adequately protect us against manipulative practices in general, or do you think more is needed? And if more is needed, what would that be?
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you very much for your question. Indeed, in the definition of online behavioral advertising, I think, as you highlighted, the very distinctive criteria of, or element what makes this practice, even in its name, but also in the functionality and configuration, is the monitoring part, the surveillance. And lately, after finishing this thesis, I switched to using the term surveillance advertising because I think that that part of surveillance is the most important or defining trait of that specific practice. You rightly highlight that many of the manipulative practices that I list in the table are related to the behavioral advertising types itself, so the advertising itself, but half of it actually, 19 of them, are not related to advertising, but they are grouped in a different way, and I will use this opportunity to explain and clarify why. When I started my research, there were two different emerging literature in academia. There was one of online manipulation and another one was of dark patterns. Dark patterns literature was very much focused on consumer consent and different online interface designs that were capturing the attention in manipulative or coercive ways. And online manipulation literature was focused on personalization algorithms and how algorithmic personalization of in different online environments can manipulate. Obviously, I enjoyed reading the literature, but I had this nagging thought that none of the literatures highlighted what was the root cause of both dark patterns or online manipulation, which I found it to be the business model. The infrastructure which was behind. And this is the reason why I chose to focus on online behavioral advertising, because this is the reason that both dark patterns in many different instances emerged, and this is the reason why the different forms of algorithmic personalization practices that are exploitative occur online. As you also rightly highlight, online behavioral advertising is not the only manipulated. Right? There are other forms of manipulations for market transactions on Amazon or other online marketplaces, which this book does not address, and we're lucky that in Leiden University we have research on that topic as well. But I chose to focus on online behavioral advertising because I thought that this is the most defining practice in terms of how online environment looks like today. So my split between, I have two chapters addressing one, manipulation by online behavioral advertising, and another one, manipulation for online behavioral advertising. So by would be typical advertisements, so for example, using mental health information to allocate an advertisement to a person, or using sexual orientation information, or targeting minors, so forms of advertising. But similarly, and also very important part of manipulation happens not by the advertising itself, but what happens so that that advertisement is possible to be shown. And I think this is what's most discussed actually when we talk about consent acquisition and autoplay and infinite scroll. This is a different part of manipulation which is for surveillance advertising, because in the end this occurs because this business model wants to be funded. Now, your question was, in the end, does this work focused on the online behavioral advertising help to address the general online, your question was if it was sufficient, and I don't think that it is sufficient. I think this can be a starting point. I don't think that this is even sufficient for online behavioral advertising. I think it's like something that we start with, and then we work on frameworks, and we build, and we see how it fits. For generally the online environment, the second biggest problem is online marketplaces and how it happens there, online influences that are exploitative. But I do think that the primary, so the central problem is indeed the advertising, because this is what funds the internet, and this largely defines what the online environment looks like. Everything, when we go online, every digital service that we use, the games that we play, the newspapers that we read, their design, the infrastructure level, it comes from online behavioral advertising being their business model. Therefore, every little clicks that we make and the way the colors are presented, it is because of this practice. And if we were to tackle this problem, we would tackle a large part of the problem, exploitative practices online.
Thank you for your clear answer.
Thank you.
Then I would invite Professor Dr. Malgeri to continue the examination.
Esteemed candidate, if I have to choose one single word describing your thesis, I would choose the word maturity, because maturity that shows both your power and your dignity. And your work shows not only profound knowledge, as the other members of the committee said, your knowledge about not only the law, but also the technological aspects and the ad tech environment, but also impressive maturity on critical thinking in theoretical abstraction, and also anticipating what the Advocate General said 2 weeks ago when you mentioned the ordinarily vulnerable consumer. Then the Advocate General said something, maybe he read your thesis. And about this, vulnerability, as you could expect, is the topic I would like to focus on. Is a key aspect in your analysis, the vulnerability of consumers, and chapters 4, or vulnerability of data subjects also, chapters 4 and 5. And you enlist 3 types of vulnerability, vulnerabilities. One of them is relational vulnerability. And I would like to ask you why you see that the relationship element is just one aspect of vulnerability, and not instead the definition or requirement of all kinds of vulnerability as defined by many mothers of the vulnerability theory, and especially if you claim to focus on power, then the relationship aspect is very important. I give you an example. In situations 1 to 7, and at page 66, you consider 2 colleagues. After having mentioned Vito Corleone and other examples, you consider 2 colleagues, X and Y, but you never reflect on the specific relationship between those 2 colleagues. What is their relationship? What is their power imbalance? Is one affected by the other, dependent on, admiring, fearing the judgment of the other? In other terms, where do we situate the relationship element of power in these scenarios? And connected to this, you assess also vulnerability on the basis of the theoretical considerations that you present in figure 3.3. And you mentioned the link between vulnerability and severity of manipulative advertising. But how do you assess different levels of vulnerability is also interesting and maybe not clear enough. Is it an empirical evaluation? Is it a normative evaluation? Thank you.
Zeer geleerd opponent, thank you very much for your question and for your words of compliment. You know obviously that this means a lot to me. I think I mentioned in my response to Professor Borgesius' question on manipulation and framework, I did mention that that framework is not perfect. And I think the question on vulnerability is the vulnerability of the framework. But in a way, it is also its strength. Because I think this is, while there are people who have studied this concept, there are many people, I think still it needs much more. And obviously the choice to have 3 different versions of vulnerability. So I mentioned relational vulnerability, situational vulnerability, and inherent vulnerability. This has a grounding in a very specific source, a way I imagine vulnerability to be. So in my framework of vulnerability, I think of it stemming not from the relationship per se, but from the human embodiment. And I will explain a bit why this is so. Traditionally, starting from Aristotle's times, when we were speaking about pure rationality or pure reasoning, humans were aware that such pure reasoning would be limited because we live, because we're alive, and we have needs. And I think that the human being, as a Homo sapiens, it has a very specific form of vulnerability. When a deer runs in an hour, it's able to run. We need years to develop into mature human beings. And I think that's when the relational part becomes so important in human beings and crucial and the most important one. But yet I choose to regard it as one because I go back to maybe a bit meta version of where does it come from, because we're alive and it's unavoidable to have that. And of course, because we are human beings, we are dependent on others, our parents, our friends, and our society. We need to function, to have everything, and that makes us so vulnerable. So I think that's where that's how I position myself in terms of relational vulnerability. I do acknowledge that I think it deserves more attention to give more weight to the relationship in the future work. Although I wanted to mention, because you mentioned the example, and I think the example happens in some sort of original position where such relationship is assumed to not exist. So it would be taken that, okay, if you take that there is no relational asymmetry, then there are other things such as situations like a pandemic happening or having some inherent characteristic or some sort of trait that could also act as a vulnerability. So I think in the end, what was the point? Because I think very important part of the framework is then later offering this framework to evaluate the online behavioral advertising and say, oh, we found the different levels of vulnerability and therefore some practices have to be limited to some extent. Some of them they're unacceptable, some of them have to be regulated, and etc. So I think that concept that's how I try to use it in a way as a tool. But obviously, the thesis doesn't cover all of these situations perfectly. One thing that I intended to defend and provide was this distinction of providing a way of thinking about an average consumer, and exactly what you pointed out, the interpretation of the Advocate General, to suggest that the average consumer as a basis is not the rational being, but ordinarily vulnerable being that has biases, that has bounded rationality, so reasons within limits, and that would be the starting point. And then the central point was that online average consumer then would be more than ordinarily vulnerable. So if there was a point to make with the framework of vulnerability that I make here, that was the only point. Everything else is an extra, everything else is a bonus. And I have those as well inside, and I think it's more provocative, more like suggesting that we can research more there and we can see how we can do empirical work and normative work. I would like to highlight also the DSA's advertising repositories, which allow us so my main problem with the platforms advertising has long been that we didn't have data access to evaluate whether these practices were actually manipulating people or hurting people or etc. Well, now we have DSA that demands some sort of transparency towards enforcers, so that we have data access, so we can check, who targets what company, who pays for what form of profiling is occurring, and etc. to get this data, and then the researchers can evaluate and take out what forms of vulnerabilities occur in those practices. And I think it's the first time that we have that opportunity, and I think frameworks such as these can be used to just think about the vulnerabilities in that way. But I do definitely agree that this needs to be empirically tested and worked through different interdisciplinary works, such as from gender studies and etc., to make this operationalizable. Thank you very much for your question. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, maybe just as a very rapid follow-up, you mentioned the example of the colleagues, X and Y, as abstract humans. And just to say that there are many more critical legal studies, gender studies, queer studies, that say that the abstract human is a privileged human. So this is also a provocation for further research that this abstract X and Y should become someone. Mm. But I'm super satisfied with your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fine, I see that some time is left for more questions. Then I would invite Professor Zuiderveen-Borgesius to continue the examination.
My distinguished candidate, I have another question, but I would like to zoom out a bit, so it's not about a specific remark in your thesis. So we have all read the thesis, the committee members, in December, and now I was thinking again about it, and I realized, so surveillance-based advertising, that you all know because of the tracking cookies, warnings, etc. on the web, has been invented in the mid-90s. Then in 95 there was the Data Protection Directive. A couple of years later that was implemented in national law. Basically surveillance advertising has been illegal since then. So that is now almost more than 25 years. Then the GDPR was adopted, had the same rules, but no, before that 2002, specific rules for cookies. So it emphasized again, surveillance-based advertising is illegal. Then 2009, the cookie rules became clearer, emphasized again, it is illegal. The whole sector is still going strong. Worse, probably 3 out of 5 richest companies in the world have this as their business model, although in Europe it has been illegal for a quarter of a century. The fun thing is that you now show that also under consumer law it is illegal, but and I agree with that, but so now I guess we should just hope for regulators to do more enforcement. But I would also like to hear whether you have any thoughts in the future. What could the EU lawmaker do better? Because apparently it is not enough to adopt good, sensible rules which prohibit societally damaging practices. And it is apparently also not enough if the lawmaker then says to regulators, you can give fines that are calculated in percentages of worldwide turnover, which can go into several billions. All that is not enough. What should the EU lawmaker do better for the next harmful practices? Well, we've seen bits starting now already with toxic output for disinformation at scale, at AI, by AI, etc. And we don't know the next problem yet, but seeing the kind of depressing history of trying to regulate surveillance-based advertising, what could the lawmaker do better rather than just hope that regulators do their job? Thank you.
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you very much for your question. I have a lot to talk, so I sometimes engage in the conversations on social media, also regarding the illegality of online behavioral advertising, which I know I shouldn't. And I am often presented with an argument from the industry lawyers that it is not true that online behavioral advertising is illegal. And my response to them is sharing your article from 2015, which does not say that it is, it doesn't say that it is illegal, but it says that you need certain legal basis, and one of them is consent, and ensuring such consent is almost unimaginable in real-time bidding architecture, so therefore, sorry, but you have to find something else. And that was 2015, and then 2018 we had GDPR making consent even more difficult, therefore the avoidance of the consent, because then to ensure that type of consent would be very, very difficult, because you would need an actual authentic choice, and to demonstrate that I actually want to be advertised that way, that's what I really, really want. To demonstrate it in each consumer case, that would be very difficult, obviously. So it makes, as you highlight, most of surveillance-based advertising in the history of Europe illegitimate, and I mentioned it in one of the propositions as well. When I started my research in 2019, I was already also in a way in apathy of this being possible to be fixed in some way, but actually, I became very optimistic about it, and I will use this chance to also share with you why. I think the issue, and obviously I cover different legislative tools, such as the personal data protection and privacy rules, also consumer protection law, but I believe that the main or the most useful, today most useful tool is and will become markets related tools such as competition law, but mostly the Digital Markets Act. Why is that? Because although there are thousands of companies that earn millions of dollars through this practice, the main beneficiaries, so a couple of actors who earn the most or who benefit the most are gatekeepers, such as Alphabet and Meta and a couple others. And this practice not being there would not harm any other actor except them. And why is that? Let's say contextual advertising or demographic regular advertising. This would mean that you wouldn't use that much amount of data for that advertising, and that means that everybody could do it. Because these gatekeepers are the ones who actually have the data, who gatekeep the internet, who observe and render consumers legible. So who are they able to say, oh, okay, I have 20,000 of this type of consumer, they behave this way. So they actually have the data. So if we were to take the online behavioral advertising from the equation, those companies would be the ones who would lose the most. And these companies are creating immense amount of wealth, not only for themselves, but also for the societies that they're embedded in. They have headquarters also in the US, but they also have firms here. They employ a lot of people. There is the whole infrastructure that evolves around them, and they are in top 10 companies. They are the root of the digital economy. And I think it is in no one's interest to kill that economical growth and welfare. So I think from the side of the enforcer, it is the, and I understand that I'm entering into more economics and political will, but this would be my observation from my research, that enforcer is trying to be careful not to cut something that is very important for the progress of the Western society, which is the accumulation of wealth. And they're waiting, in a way, to see creation of alternative models, to see alternative businesses, and only thing, or the most major thing to be done, is to open the gates, to create fairer options to other alternatives to emerge. And I think, of course, the regulators and enforcers are limited to what they can do. Then there has to be innovation, there has to be a creative endeavor coming from the businesses, hopefully European businesses, who fill that gap after the gates are open, after the possibility of competition, because until now there was no possibility to compete, nor to Meta, nor to Alphabet. It was no possibility, and this has been very clear from market studies from Germany, from France, from Spain, from US, all agree that until now there was no possibility to compete in the advertising market to these two companies. And if we assume that DMA can open that gate, then there is a potential of the alternative businesses to emerge and compete and maybe provide other infrastructures that are more fair and provide autonomy to people. So I'm very optimistic, and especially with the Meta Bundeskartellamt case, the starting of taking the action in terms of from the competition law perspective, and seeing the DMA enforcement starting. As you will see, as you have seen, one of my first recommendations suggests 7th of March will be when DMA fully applies, and I advise the enforcer to start the investigation of the Meta and Alphabet's practices. And in April, they started the investigation of Meta's online behavioral advertising practice, both through DMA and DSA, because this is a route where the problems come from.
Est.
Mr. Candidate, the time allotted to the examination of your dissertation and its propositions has passed, and the committee withdraws in order to deliberate. I request that you and your company wait or return here. Mr. Candidate, we have examined your dissertation and the propositions appended thereto. We've heard your defense and your lecture to a certain degree. And we have considered the report by the faculty concerning your previous study. And on the basis of this, we have decided to admit you to the doctorate. And Professor Kusters is empowered to confer that dignity upon you in the customary fashion, that's to say in Dutch. And he will do that also on behalf of the other promoter, Professor Simone van der Hof, and the co-promoter, Dr. De Chaine.
Volgaande aanvaard ik de taak mij door de rector magnificus der universiteit opgedragen. Volgaande aanvaard ik de taak mij door de rector magnificus der universiteit opgedragen. Uit kracht dan van de bevoegdheid ons bij wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik u bij deze Alexandre Zardiasvili, alias Lex Zard, te bevorderen tot dokter. Ten bewijze hiervan zal u het diploma door rector, secretaris en promotoris en co-promotor ondertekend en met het grootzegel der universiteit bevestigd ter hand worden gesteld. Nadat ik alzo de mij opgelegde taak heb volbracht, mag ik de eerste zijn u als dokter begroet en zo met de verkregen waardigheid gelukwens. Waardeer haar als een eervolle onderscheiding en een welverdiend voorrecht, maar vergeet daarbij nooit de verplichtingen die zij u oplegt, jegens de wetenschap en de samenleving.
The laudatio will be pronounced by Dr. De Chaine, also on behalf of the promoters.
Dear young doctor, Lex Zard, dear Alexandre, dear Lexo, you made it. Hora erat. And I wrote you're still alive, but I don't even think you were nervous. Congratulations on your stellar performance at the defense and on the beautiful book you delivered. The committee in its entirety, also including Shoshana Zuboff, was deeply impressed by your excellent work. We would also like to extend the congratulations to your mother, who is here with us, to Agatha, to your family and friends, some of whom are with us online. What a moment in our joint journey that started in the academic year of 2017-2018, when you came, like some of the people in the audience here, as a student of our advanced LLM in Law and Digital Technologies. And now you are the first LDT alumnus to defend their PhD thesis at our own team, with us at ELAW. It has been our pleasure to see you develop from close by, from the start of your journey. Professor Bart Kusters was your thesis supervisor in the Advanced Master, and you and I met when Professor Simone van der Hof handed you your diploma at your graduation in August 2018. You hit it off immediately as my research assistant for the Scales project on responsible data analytics and for the AI ethics for the Dutch police project. Already then, did you write 2 academic publications, including a prize-winning collaboration on dignity in robotics with Edward. As supervisors, we could see your passion and sometimes stubbornness with which you developed and argued your opinions. And in the beginning, they were mostly opinions. Pretty early on, your ambition seemed to become to give an irrefutable, maybe even analytic proof that based on human dignity, online behavioral advertising, I wrote should be legally forbidden, but I understand that it already was legally forbidden. But your argument was going to be that it should be on the basis of human dignity. To get there, you did not shy away from going all the way into the primary sources in classical and modern philosophy, and were on your way to almost a thesis in itself on the concept and history of dignity. While the chapter never got finished, and only tiny bits of that text made it into your thesis, all that foundational intellectual labor noticeably made it into you. It was impressive to see how, in the final year, you managed to kill many darlings, including explicit references showing off the depth of your reading. But it is clear to me how it made you develop as a person, and maybe we recognize Aristotle in the virtue of moderation that you adopted, leading to a much less categorical conclusion than we would have expected earlier. On several occasions, you proved to be persuasive, with your cocktail of personal charm, fascination with great thinkers, authentic interest, and intellectual curiosity. They make great minds want to engage with you. In April 2021, you got some of the most prominent thinkers to exchange thoughts on your thesis topic in the online panel on targeted advertising and human dignity. And at CPDP 2023, you put together the ELAW panel. I see somebody, one of our panelists. You put together this CPDP panel on online behavioral advertising with such prominent panelists that it became the closing session of the conference. In these remarkable events, you showed to have no problem steering the debate and engage with great minds on your topic of expertise. And today, this time answering rather than asking the questions, you showed how it is indeed your topic of expertise. Looking back on those panels also makes me aware that I should mention how well you dealt with the limiting circumstances of the pandemic and still got out of it what you could. You were one of the many people who had to find their position in academia, while opportunities to travel to conferences and experience the serendipity of spontaneous interactions with peers and seniors were severely limited. Little were we able to anticipate those effects during our lunch on Friday the 13th, March 2020, as the last people on the ship, referring to Chernobyl, you were going on about Chernobyl that you just watched. Trying to finish whatever food was in the fridge, suddenly acutely aware that the near future was uncertain. You have been of great support to the Advanced Master's Program and the students during that time. And personally, I will never forget our highly inspirational online book club on Friday afternoons, where we read a number of dystopian classics, which lifted our spirits under the circumstances and inspired us both to focus on the essentials of a good life, including personal connection. We encourage you to see now as your time to catch up on some of the embodied experiences with new people in new environments that you missed out on. You already had a taste of it last summer when you were selected to participate in the Oxford Internet Institute Summer School. We will continue to support you in finding an environment that suits your further development as a researcher best. You showed us you are and will be an academic to reckon with. You definitely rooted here at ELAW with us, and we look forward to see you blossom in the coming years. Dear Lexo, I was already very proud when people in our field noted that ELAW had such mature PhD students just after speaking to you. Words fall short to describe how proud I am today, and also the rector will cut me off here.
Thank you. Well, it's an agreeable duty for me, esteemed Dr. Zardiashvili, to congratulate you upon your degree, also on behalf of the university and its Council of Deans. And herewith I declare this ceremony closed.
You was up to the Italian